The sound of her scream is burned into my chest like a scar I'll never erase. It was sharp, sudden, and full of fear. Fear I had promised her she'd never feel again as long as I was breathing. I was only halfway down the driveway when I saw them, two HOA enforcers in pressed shirts, their hands gripping my wife by the arms, pushing her against the gate like she was some criminal trespassing on her own land. She's small, gentle, the kind of woman who apologizes even when someone bumps into her at the grocery store. And there she was, eyes wide with terror, fighting to breathe under their weight. My pulse spiked. My world went red. They didn't know me yet. They didn't know what I was capable of. They didn't know I had spent half my life hunting men who thought they could break others. I broke into a run. But the moments leading up to that sprint are seared into me as the ones where I felt most helpless. For a split second, I was just a husband watching his wife suffer, not a soldier trained to kill. My boots pounded the gravel as my throat burned with rage. When I finally reached them, one of the men barked something about HOA regulations and non-compliance with gate modifications, as if that was justification for putting their hands on her, as if a rule book gave them power over my family. My wife gasped my name, relief and terror twisting her voice. The sight of her bruised wrist flipped a switch inside me I'd hoped never to flip again. The Navy may have retired me, but the Navy never left me. I grabbed the first enforcer by the collar and slammed him against the iron gate so hard the metal rattled. His smug face twisted into shock. He wasn't ready for someone who didn't cower before a clipboard. The other one tried to pull my wife away like she was a piece of property to drag off, and that's when I let muscle memory take over. One hand, one precise movement, and I had him face down in the dirt, his arm twisted in a lock he'd feel for days. My wife stumbled back, clutching her chest, tears streaking down her cheeks. Her fear cut deeper into me than any knife ever could. "Look at her," I snarled at them, my voice low but carrying the weight of every battlefield I'd survived. "Does that look like enforcing rules to you? Or does it look like assault?" They stammered, their confidence unraveling fast. I wanted to break them then and there, but I didn't. I released them, shoving both away like the trash they were. They scrambled, muttering about consequences and calling the board. I didn't care. Let them call whoever they wanted. What they didn't realize was that this was war, and they had just picked the wrong man's family to start it with. That night, I sat with my wife by the fire, holding her as she trembled in my arms. She tried to brush it off, saying she was fine, but her body told the truth. Her breathing was shallow, her shoulders stiff, her hand shaking when it touched mine. I kissed her forehead and whispered promises I intended to keep. No one would touch her again. No one would make her cry on her own porch. Not the HOA, not their enforcers, not their smug little president who thought power meant paperwork and intimidation. They wanted a fight? I'd give them one they'd never forget. But revenge, I knew, wasn't about throwing fists in the dark. It had to be measured, precise, like the missions I once led overseas. These people were arrogant, shielded by their titles and bylaws. They thought homeowners were pawns, too scared to rise up. I knew my neighbors had felt the same fear my wife had felt at that gate. They'd whispered their frustrations, paid fines they couldn't afford, and bowed their heads when confronted. But me? I had faced men with bombs strapped to their chests. I had stared death in the eye and refused to blink. An HOA board? They were nothing more than bullies with a budget. Still, I wasn't reckless. The next morning, I walked the property with a notebook in hand, jotting down every violation of theirs I'd seen ignored. Illegal drainage near the playground, unapproved fencing by one of their own, misused funds from last year's landscaping. Budget. I documented it all with the precision of a sniper lining up his scope. My wife watched me, her eyes still swollen from the night before, but now there was something else there too. Hope. She knew I wasn't just reacting. I was planning. Later, I spoke quietly with my neighbors. One by one they nodded, their anger rising as I told them what had happened to my wife. They showed me their own scars, ridiculous fines, harassment, over paint colors, threats of foreclosure. The HOA had kept them divided, scared, alone. But together we were stronger. My military days had taught me one thing above all. Victory comes when the unit stands as one. And I was ready to lead this fight. But deep down, revenge for me wasn't only about the HOA as an institution. It was personal. Those enforcers had put hands on the woman who had stood by me through nightmares and deployments, who had written me letters when sandstorms kept me from calling home. They had dared to make her feel powerless. And I was going to make sure they never forgot the day they made that mistake. So I waited, patiently, with a soldier's calm. I watched their routines, tracked their arrogance, let them believe they had scared us into silence. Every bully's downfall is the same. They underestimate the quiet. And in that quiet, plans are made. The enforcers laughed when they passed our home again, one of them nursing his wrist in a sling. But the smirk on his lips told me he thought they still owned us. I didn't even glare back. I just smiled. The kind of smile I once gave before ambushes. The storm hadn't come yet, but it was building. And when it finally broke, it would wash their empire of petty rules and cheap threats into the dirt they had ground my wife's tears into. The days that followed were heavy, the kind where silence clings to the walls of your home and every small sound feels like it carries too much weight. My wife tried to act normal, baking bread, watering her plants, folding laundry with hands that still trembled when she thought I wasn't watching. But I saw. I always saw. She'd wince when she touched her wrist, the one the enforcer had gripped too hard. At night, she'd shift in bed, turning away so I wouldn't notice the tears she couldn't hold back. It cut me in ways no bullet ever had. I'd fought wars, crossed oceans, stared down enemies who wanted me dead, but I had never felt as broken as I did watching her cry in our own home. That's when I knew this wasn't just about revenge, it was about healing. For her. For us. And for everyone who had lived too long under the HOA's shadow. If I let this pass, if I turned away, she'd never feel safe again. None of us would. I started with information. Knowledge I'd learned long ago was the sharpest weapon you could carry into battle. I filed requests, dug through public records, and uncovered layers of corruption that ran deep. The HOA president, a smug man named Carter Reeves, had been funneling money meant for community maintenance into side projects he owned, landscaping contracts awarded to his brother-in-law, inflated fees that vanished into administrative costs, fines that never made it into the association's budget. It was theft, dressed up in paperwork and stamped with official seals. But it wasn't enough to know. I needed proof. So I gathered it. Copies of invoices, emails leaked by a disgruntled former secretary, photographs of work never done though bills were paid. I worked late into the night, my desk covered in files. My old military discipline driving me forward. Every detail was a bullet loaded into a magazine I would one day unleash. Meanwhile, I reached out quietly to neighbors, testing the waters. At first, they were hesitant, their voices hushed as if the HOA could hear through walls. But when I told them what happened to my wife, the fear turned into fury. Mrs. Jenkins, the widow down the street, had been fined $500 for a non-compliant mailbox. She had lived here 20 years before the HOA even existed, and they'd threatened to put a lien on her house. Then there was the Lopez family, fined for their kids' bikes being left in the driveway, nearly forced into foreclosure when they couldn't pay in time. The stories piled up, each one fueling the fire inside me. I knew then I wasn't just fighting for my wife. I was fighting for an entire community suffocated under Carter Reeves's reign, and like any operation worth its salt, I needed allies. I began forming them quietly, one by one, neighbors who were tired of bending their necks. They didn't know it yet, but I was building a unit, the kind of brotherhood I hadn't felt since my days in the SEALs. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, I sat with my wife on the porch. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, the air, heavy with late summer heat. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, but I could feel the distance in her. "What if they come back?" she whispered, her voice fragile, almost breaking. My jaw tightened, my hand gripping hers with a promise. "If they come back, they'll regret ever stepping foot near this gate," I said. "I'm not letting anyone hurt you again, not while I'm here." But inside, I felt the weight of something bigger. Revenge wasn't going to be enough. Not just breaking a few bones or scaring a couple of hired thugs. No, what I wanted was to dismantle their empire brick by brick, to expose them so thoroughly that their power evaporated overnight. I wanted justice, and I wanted it in a way that made my wife smile again. The chance came sooner than I expected. A letter arrived in the mail, printed on crisp HOA letterhead with Carter Reeves's signature at the bottom. They were fining us $1,200 for unauthorized gate modifications. My wife's gasp when she read it nearly broke me. Her hands shook as she passed it to me, her face pale. They were still trying to scare us, even after everything. But instead of anger, I felt something colder, clarity. This wasn't just harassment, this was arrogance. They thought they could still control us, even after laying hands on her. They thought I'd fold like the others. They didn't know who they were playing with. I stood, letter in hand, and looked out at the gate, the very one they'd used as a weapon against her. In that moment, I made my decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to make the next move. I was going to take the fight to them. That night, I pulled out an old trunk from the back of the garage. Inside were remnants of a life I thought I'd left behind. Dog tags, maps, training manuals, and a small black notebook filled with tactics and notes I'd kept through years of missions. My wife walked in as I opened it, her eyes widening, when she saw. "You're scaring me," she said softly. I closed the trunk and took her hands. "You don't have to be scared anymore," I told her. "I'm not just your husband. I'm a SEAL. And it's time they remembered what that means." I kissed her forehead and whispered, "They drew first blood. Now it's my turn." The war with the HOA had officially begun. The first real move came on a humid Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the air hangs heavy and even the birds are quiet. I was in the garage fixing the hinges on an old toolbox when I heard tires crunching against the gravel outside. My gut told me before my eyes did. Trouble. When I stepped, out there they were, the same two enforcers who had laid hands on my wife. They stood at the gate with clipboards in hand, smug as ever, pretending like the past hadn't happened. One had his wrist still strapped in a sling, a souvenir from our last encounter. The other smirked at me like I was just another homeowner, beneath his authority. "We're here to serve notice," the one with the sling said, his tone rehearsed, like a man who thought words on a paper gave him power. "You have 30 days to comply with the board's order regarding your gate or face further penalties." He slid a document through the bars like it was an eviction letter. I didn't touch it. Instead, I let the silence stretch until it turned heavy, until I saw the smirk fade just a little. My wife stepped out onto the porch then, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. The sight of them made her stiffen, and I saw her retreat 2 steps back toward the door. That tiny movement lit something dark in me. They had stolen her sense of safety, her peace in her own home. I wasn't going to let it stand. "You think you can walk onto my property after what you did?" I said, my voice low and steady. "You think this piece of paper means anything after you put your hands on her?" The man with the sling shifted, uncomfortably, his eyes darting to his partner. "Sir, we're just enforcing—" I cut him off, stepping close enough that my shadow fell over both of them. "Enforcing what? Corruption? Assault? Theft? You're not enforcers. You're hired bullies, and you just picked the wrong man to bully." The second man, the one who hadn't spoken yet, tried to laugh it off. "We're just doing our job. You think you're scaring us?" He puffed his chest, but his eyes betrayed the unease he felt. He wasn't used to pushback. None of them were. That's what the HOA relied on: fear and silence. I leaned close enough that he could see. The steel in my eyes, the years of training, the ghosts of battles I'd fought and survived. "Son," I said quietly, "I used to make men 3 times your size beg for mercy in languages they didn't even know they could speak. You don't scare me, you disgust me." I let the paper flutter to the ground and turned my back on them, the ultimate dismissal. My wife slipped inside and I followed, but before I closed the door I called out one last thing. "Tell Carter Reeves I'm coming for him. Tell him the rules have changed." That night, I set the plan into motion. Step 1 was exposure. I compiled everything I had: financial records, witness statements from neighbors, photographs of violations the board had ignored for their own friends. I knew that if I could get this into the hands of the right people, Carter's empire would crumble. But I also knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. Men like him, who built their little kingdoms on intimidation, always fought hardest when they sensed the end coming. And I wasn't wrong. The very next day, letters went out across the neighborhood. Fines, violations, threats of foreclosure. They were trying to drown us all in paperwork, to break us before we could rise. My phone rang non-stop. Neighbors scared, angry, desperate. Mrs. Jenkins sobbing because she couldn't afford another fine. The Lopez family terrified they'd lose their home. I listened to each of them, steady and calm, the way I had once spoken to my men before a dangerous mission. "Stand tall," I told them. "This is exactly what bullies do when they're afraid. And it means we're winning. Stay with me." My wife sat beside me as I made those calls, her hand resting on my leg. For the first time since the attack, I saw the fear in her eyes start to shift into something else: pride. She was still shaken, still healing, but she was watching me fight not just for her, but for all of them. The next step was confrontation. Not fists, not yet, but words sharpened into weapons. I showed up at the next HOA board meeting. They weren't expecting me. The room was filled with board members in pressed suits, their smug faces bent over agendas and budgets. Carter Reeves sat at the head of the table, his gold watch catching the light as if to remind everyone who held the power here. When I walked in, the room went still. Neighbors who had come to watch shifted in their chairs, whispers spreading like wildfire. Carter's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Hale," he said, drawing out my name like it was a nuisance on his tongue. "I wasn't aware you were attending." "I'm not attending," I said, stepping forward until I was standing at the front, every eye in the room on me. "I'm exposing." I laid the stack of evidence on the table with a thud that made the pens jump. Invoices, emails, photographs, all of it, spread out for the room to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd as neighbors leaned in to read, their faces shifting from confusion to anger to fury. Carter's face flushed, his smugness cracking for the first time. "This is nonsense," he stammered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Baseless accusations, nothing more." "Baseless," I said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of every mission briefing I'd ever given. "Then explain why $40,000 in landscaping fees went to your brother-in-law's company for work that was never done. Explain why Mrs. Jenkins was fined for her mailbox while your secretary's fence went unapproved and untouched. Explain why you thought you could send hired thugs to assault my wife on her own property and get away with it." The room erupted, neighbors shouting, board members shifting uncomfortably, whispers turning into demands. Carter tried to slam his gavel, shouting for order, but the power had already slipped from his grip. For the first time, he wasn't the man in control. I was. And I wasn't stopping here. The boardroom that night was chaos. Neighbors were on their feet, voices overlapping, anger spilling into the air like gasoline waiting for a match. Carter slammed his gavel again and again, his face red, sweat pooling at his temples, but it was useless. He had lost control. For years, people had swallowed their anger, paid their fines, and bowed their heads to his authority. But once fear breaks, it never comes back the same. And I could see it. These people were done being scared. My wife sat in the back row, her hand clutching the edge of the chair, eyes wide as she watched it unfold. For the first time since that horrible day at the gate, I saw something return. To her expression. Hope. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't shrinking back. She was leaning forward, her lips parted, watching me like maybe, just maybe, the man she had always believed me to be was finally pulling her world back together. That sight alone was worth every risk I was taking. Carter tried to regain ground. These so-called documents, he spat, gesturing toward the evidence I'd laid on the table, prove nothing. Do you think anyone here understands the complexities of managing a community, of keeping order? Rules are rules for a reason. Without us, this neighborhood would collapse into chaos. His voice rose with desperation, but it only made the crowd angrier. A man I'd never seen speak up before. Quiet, older, always keeping to himself, stood and shouted, "Chaos? You fined me $200 for leaving my trash can out an extra night. My wife was in the hospital. That's not order. That's theft." The crowd roared in agreement, voices lifting like a wave. Carter paled, his fingers tightening on the gavel, but it was useless now. I leaned forward, my voice calm, cutting through the noise like a blade. Order doesn't come from fear. It comes from fairness, from respect. Something you've forgotten. That was when Carter's mask cracked completely. His voice lost its practiced smoothness, his words spilling like poison. Fairness? You think you know fairness? You're nothing but a washed-up soldier trying to play hero in a homeowners association. This is my board, my community, and you don't scare me. He shouldn't have said that. Because in that moment, I knew exactly how to finish what I'd started. I didn't need to scare him with fists or threats. I just needed to let him expose himself. And he had. I picked up one of the invoices, held it high, and read aloud. $12,500 paid to Reeves Landscaping, owned by none other than your brother-in-law. Work never completed. And yet, neighbors fined hundreds for uncut grass. Murmurs exploded around the room. I dropped the paper on the table like a gauntlet. You talk about community? You've bled this place dry while terrorizing its people. And you're about to answer for every dollar, every threat, and every bruise you caused. The meeting dissolved into shouts. Carter stormed out, his cronies scrambling after him, leaving the boardroom in uproar. I stayed behind, calming the neighbors, guiding their anger into focus. This isn't over, I told them, but tonight we've taken back the first piece of our home. When I walked out into the cool night air, my wife slipped her hand into mine. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with tears, but they weren't from fear this time. They were from pride. "I saw you in there," she whispered. "I saw the man who used to write me letters from overseas, promising you'd always come back. You're fighting for us again." Her words hit deeper than anything Carter could ever say. I squeezed her hand, pressing it against my chest. "I never stopped fighting for you," I told her. "Now I'm just bringing the battle home." But I knew Carter wouldn't take this lying down. Men like him never do. And sure enough, retaliation came swift. 2 nights later, just past midnight, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence of our home. My wife's scream ripped me from bed, instincts flaring awake like they had never dulled. I grabbed the bat I kept under the frame and rushed to the living room. A brick lay in the middle of the floor, shards of glass scattered like diamonds in the moonlight. My wife clutched her robe tight, trembling, her eyes darting toward the window. Outside, I caught the flash of taillights disappearing into the dark. It wasn't random. It was a message. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. As I scanned the yard, my mind already racing through tactics. They thought they could scare us into silence again. They thought breaking a window could break our resolve. But they had no idea the kind of war they had just reignited. I kissed her temple, whispering steady into her hair. They don't know who they're dealing with, but they will. The fight with Carter Reeves and his enforcers wasn't over. It was only beginning. And this time I wasn't just bringing evidence. I was bringing war. The brick through our window changed everything. It wasn't just vandalism, it was escalation. The HOA had stopped pretending this was about rules and regulations. Now it was intimidation, plain and simple. And while fear might have worked on my neighbors, it would never work on me. If anything, it fueled the fire already burning in my chest. My wife didn't sleep that night. She sat curled on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the broken window like it was a wound in our home. I taped up the glass temporarily, but the chill of the night still slipped through, making her shiver even under blankets. I crouched in front of her, lifting her chin until her tear-filled eyes met mine. "They want us afraid," I said softly. "But fear is their weapon. We don't play by their rules anymore. We fight back." Her voice broke when she whispered, "What if they hurt you?" I kissed her hands, scarred and trembling. "They won't. They'll try, but they don't know the man they're facing. They don't know what I've done to survive, and I'll survive this too, because of you." The next morning, I took steps Carter never could have anticipated. I called an old friend from my Navy days, a man who now worked private security. His voice boomed with laughter when I explained the situation, but when he heard how my wife had been treated, his tone turned razor sharp. "Send me what you've got," he said. "I'll make sure this board doesn't just face angry neighbors. They'll face real consequences." Within 48 hours, I had a legal contact lined up, a journalist hungry for corruption stories, and a small group of veterans from the neighborhood willing to back me if things got physical again. For the first time, the playing field wasn't just even. It was tilting in my direction, but Carter wasn't sitting still either. Flyers started appearing on doors, painting me as a violent thug, claiming I had physically assaulted HOA officials and was endangering the community. Lies spun to make me the villain. Some neighbors looked at me differently when I passed. Hesitation in their eyes. I understood. Fear makes people believe whatever story promises safety. That night at dinner, my wife's fork clattered against her plate. She was pale, staring at her phone. "They're saying horrible things about you on the community page," she whispered. "They're calling you dangerous." I reached across the table, steadying her shaking hand. "Let them talk. Words are wind. When the truth comes out, they'll see who's really dangerous." But inside, I felt the old instincts kicking in, the part of me that never trusted enemies to play fair. Carter was escalating, which meant he was scared, and a scared man was unpredictable. I had to stay 2 steps ahead, so I laid my own trap. The next HOA inspection was scheduled for Friday afternoon. I knew they'd come to my property again, probably with more enforcers, maybe even Carter himself. So I installed cameras, hidden but precise, covering every angle of the gate, the driveway, the porch. If they laid a finger on me or my wife again, I'd have proof. Not just hearsay, not just bruises, but undeniable evidence. Sure enough, Friday came, and with it, 3 black SUVs rolling up to my gate. Out stepped Carter in a tailored suit, flanked by 4 enforcers. My wife froze at the window, fear flooding her eyes. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "Stay inside. Watch. Trust me." I stepped out slowly, every movement calm, deliberate. Carter adjusted his tie, trying to look confident, but the twitch in his jaw gave him away. "Mr. Hale," he said, his voice oily. We've come to inform you that your continued hostility toward this association cannot be tolerated. If you refuse to comply, we will have no choice but to pursue legal action." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch, then tilted my head. "Legal action?" I repeated. Interesting choice of words, because I've got a stack of evidence that says you've been breaking the law for years. His smile faltered, just for a second. "Baseless claims," he snapped. "Baseless?" I pulled a folder from under my arm, flipping it open just enough for him to see the copies inside. Invoices, emails, witness statements, proof of fraud, embezzlement, and harassment. You think you've got power? You've got nothing but a sinking ship, Carter. And you just dragged your crew into the storm with you." One of the enforcers stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "You can't threaten us." I smiled coldly. "That wasn't a threat. That was a promise." Behind me, hidden in the shadows, the cameras recorded everything. The posturing, the intimidation, Carter's nervous glances. They thought they were putting on a show of power. What they didn't know was that they had just given me exactly what I needed: undeniable proof of harassment and intimidation on my own property. When they finally left, tires spitting gravel, my wife came running out, tears streaming down her face. "They're going to destroy us," she whispered. I pulled her close, my voice firm in her ear. "No, they just destroyed themselves. And tomorrow, the whole world is going to know who they really are. Because the evidence wasn't staying in my hands anymore. It was going to the press. And once it was out there, Carter's empire of fear was going to crumble under the weight of the truth." The morning the article went live, the neighborhood felt different. I woke before dawn, made coffee, and sat on the porch with my wife curled against me. She was still fragile, her smile hesitant, but there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen in weeks: anticipation. At 6 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message from the journalist. "It's up. Front page." By 7 Sakar, the calls started. Neighbors one after another, their voices breathless, angry, alive. The article laid it all bare: the embezzlement, the fraudulent contracts, the intimidation tactics. There were photos, scanned invoices, even video clips from the cameras I'd installed showing Carter and his enforcers trespassing on my property. My name wasn't just cleared, it was vindicated. I walked down the driveway and watched as clusters of neighbors gathered on their lawns, waving printed copies of the article like flags. People who had once been too afraid to speak were suddenly bold, their anger burning hotter than the August sun. Mrs. Jenkins, usually quiet, marched right up the street with her cane in one hand and the article in the other, shouting, "They've been stealing from us!" Others followed her lead, knocking on doors, rallying each other. By noon, the HOA office was surrounded. Dozens of neighbors filled the parking lot, demanding answers, their chants echoing through the air. My wife stood at my side, her hand gripping mine, her cheeks flushed with emotion. For the first time, I saw her shoulders lift, her head held high. The fear those men had planted in her was cracking, replaced by something stronger: courage. But Carter wasn't done yet. Around 2 a black SUV pulled into the lot, and out he came, his face pale but his jaw set. He tried to push through the crowd, shouting about lies and defamation, but no one listened. The people he'd ruled through fear were finally seeing him for what he was. Someone threw the article at his feet, the papers scattering like the pieces of his empire. I stepped forward then, not raising my voice, not needing to. "You thought you could control this community with threats and greed," I said, my words cutting through the noise. "You put your hands on my wife, Carter. You tried to silence us. But you forgot one thing. I don't scare easy, and neither do they. Not anymore." The crowd roared behind me, the sound shaking the air. For the first time, Carter looked small. He wasn't a king at the head of a boardroom anymore. He was just a man exposed, cornered, and powerless. That night, as the sun dipped low, the sheriff's department came. 2 deputies walked into Carter's office and walked him out in handcuffs, his head down, his face ashen. The charges, fraud, embezzlement, harassment, were only the beginning. His enforcers scattered like rats, suddenly nowhere to be found. The HOA board crumbled in a single day, their power evaporating under the weight of truth. But the real victory wasn't in Carter's arrest. It was in my wife's smile when we got home. She sat on the porch swing, looking out at the gate where it had all begun. Her hand rested gently on mine, no longer trembling, no longer hesitant. "It feels like I can breathe again," she whispered. I wrapped my arm around her, pressing a kiss to her hair. "That's what this was always about. Not just revenge, freedom. For you. For everyone." For the first time in weeks, we slept without fear. The house was quiet, whole again, the broken window replaced with fresh glass that gleamed in the moonlight. I lay awake for a moment, listening to my wife's steady breathing beside me, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. But deep down, I knew men like Carter never truly disappear. Power attracts power, and there would always be others, like him, waiting for their chance to rule through fear. And if they came here, if they ever tried again, they'd find me waiting. A retired Navy SEAL, a husband, a protector. The air was thick with relief in the days that followed Carter's arrest, but beneath the calm I could feel the neighborhood simmering with the energy of change. It wasn't over yet, not truly. Justice had only just begun, and I knew we needed more than the fall of one man to heal what had been broken. My wife and I walked the streets together, neighbors stopping us every few steps, their eyes filled with gratitude, their voices trembling with apologies for not standing up sooner. She smiled at them, not with bitterness, but with forgiveness. That was her strength. Mine had always been to fight, but hers was to heal. A week later, a meeting was called. Not by the old board, not by any self-appointed ruler, but by the people themselves. We gathered in the community center, the same place Carter had once held his iron-fisted hearings. The room was packed wall to wall, voices low, expectant. My wife and I sat in the front row, hand in hand. When they asked me to speak, I rose slowly, the weight of years of service and recent battles heavy on my shoulders, but my voice steady. This community is more than a set of rules, more than fines and threats, I said, scanning the faces in front of me. We've been divided, made to fear each other, to turn on our neighbors. But look around you now. This is strength. Not Carter, not his board. Us, together. And it's time we take back what was ours all along. The crowd erupted in applause. Not wild, but heartfelt. The kind that comes from people who've been freed from chains they didn't know they carried. My wife squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening with tears, and for a moment I felt like the man I used to be, the leader my SEAL brothers had once looked to when things seemed impossible. The following weeks were a storm of rebuilding. A new board was elected, one made of people who genuinely cared, not about money, but about community. The bylaws were stripped of their harshest rules, the ridiculous fines abolished. The lake, once restricted, was reopened for families, laughter echoing across the water where silence had once reigned. For the first time in years, kids played freely in the streets without parents worrying about citations for noise. It was as if the neighborhood itself had been waiting for this breath of freedom. But the moment that sealed it came one evening at the gate, the same gate where my wife had been attacked. She asked me to walk there with her. As the sun dipped low, she paused, running her fingers along the iron bars. For weeks, this place had been a symbol of pain and humiliation. Now, she looked at it with something different in her eyes. "I thought I'd never feel safe here again," she whispered, "but now." Now it feels like home. I pulled her into my arms, the orange glow of the sunset painting her face with warmth. That's because it is, I said softly. No one takes that from us again. As we stood there, neighbors began gathering around us, unplanned but united. Someone brought out candles, their small flames flickering in the dusk. Soon the entire street was glowing, the gate no longer a boundary of fear, but a monument to what we had overcome together. My wife leaned her head on my shoulder, tears slipping down her cheeks, and for the first time since that night, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of healing. Justice had been served, not just through the courts, but through the unity of a community no longer willing to bow to tyranny. Carter would face his consequences in prison, but his legacy of fear had been burned to ash, replaced with something far stronger. As I looked around at the faces lit by candlelight, neighbors, who had once been strangers, now bound together by fire and fight, I realized something. I had spent years carrying the weight of battles overseas, protecting my country from threats far from home. But this battle right here had been the most important of all. Protecting my wife, protecting my neighbors, protecting the very idea of home. I wasn't just a retired Navy SEAL. I wasn't just a husband. I was proof that when you stand up against injustice, when you refuse to back down, even the darkest nights can end in dawn. And as I held my wife at that gate, surrounded by the people we had fought for, I knew one thing with certainty. No matter what came next, no one would ever break us again.